Hey, what's happening? My name is occasionally goukigod, and in this video I wanted to discuss a theory that I have with you. I've been playing a huge amount of Overwatch recently, more than any other first-person shooter this year, and I believe that's the same for a lot of people, with it just clocking over 15 million unique online players. That's a lot of people for a brand new game. But here's my theory. Is Overwatch actually a first-person shooter, or does it share more in common with fighting games? I play a lot of FPSs, so Call of Duty, Battlefront, Battlefield, the whole lot. I play an awful lot of those sort of games, but I also play a lot of fighting games. I've been a fan of Street Fighter since I was 12. And the more that I play Overwatch, the more that I think it's actually a first-person fighting game. Aside from the first-person perspective, there are a huge amount of parallels between Overwatch and a game like Street Fighter V. So that's what I want to discuss in this video. I want to give you some examples and explain why I think Overwatch is more of a fighting game than a first-person shooter. Just before I get into this, I'm just going to say that I'm going to use Street Fighter an awful lot as my examples, because Street Fighter is the fighting game that I'm most familiar with. But that's not to say that Overwatch doesn't share similarities with other fighting games as well. But anyway, let's get started. One of the most obvious things about Overwatch that looks like a fighting game is the design and appearance. The character select screen, for instance, is incredibly similar to a fighting game. All the character portraits are laid out in a very similar way, and when you hover over one, you get a detailed image of the actual character. There are similarities in the game as well. The health bar down the bottom left-hand side and the character icon are also very reminiscent of a fighting game. You also get health meters in-game that hover above characters' heads that give you an indication of how close a character is to dying. The character roster itself is also very similar in size to a typical fighting game, but one of the biggest similarities I would say is with the characters themselves. They're all really distinct, representing different ethnic backgrounds and different fighting styles. This is unlike most other shooters where you generally play as the same soldier. Games like Call of Duty now have these hero characters with unique special abilities, but all their other traits and characteristics are pretty much the same. You have the same basic movement speed, you have the same mobility options. The differences generally come from how you set your character up, so the weapons that you choose and the perks will change your character's abilities. Characters from fighting games have these abilities preset. You don't customize the way that your character works, and this is true for Overwatch as well. Now, along with all the characters being very unique and distinct, representing different backgrounds, they're also generally stereotypes. So for instance, Reinhardt is a German muscle man, very much like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I know that Arnold Schwarzenegger is Austrian, but I think you know what I'm getting at. And Zaya is another good example, being a very obvious stereotype of a Russian. These stereotypes are also very prevalent in Street Fighter, with both Zangief and Dalsim being obvious examples of their cultural stereotypes. Now, Overwatch has very specific classes of these characters. Obviously you have tanks, and then you have the assault characters and the support characters. Fighting games don't usually label characters like this from the character select screen, but they still do have them. For instance, in Street Fighter V you have tank characters like Zangief and Alex, who are slow and need to get up close to deal damage, but once they do, can be incredibly dangerous. The obvious parallel from Overwatch here would be Reinhardt. On the other hand, you have fast characters that can deal a lot of damage very quickly, but die very quickly because they have very low health and armor. Examples from the Street Fighter universe would be Yun or Chun-Li, and the obvious doppelgangers from Overwatch would be Genji or Tracer or McCree or any of the other assault characters. And just like most fighting games, there are counterpick characters in Overwatch. So for instance, zoning characters in fighting games are very effective at countering characters like Zangief who don't have any kind of projectile. Overwatch's gameplay and a lot of the strategy is heavily based on counterpicks and being able to counter what the other team is doing. A good example would be D.Va on Torbjorn. Torbjorn's turrets can be very effective against a lot of different players, but D.Va can easily get up close and do a lot of damage very quickly and make life very difficult for Torbjorn. Reaper and Reinhardt is also another really good example. Reinhardt is super powerful up close, but not against Reaper, who will just shred through him in an instant. And that brings me on to the next similarity, that characters in Overwatch as well as characters in fighting games have unique moves and abilities and therefore play very differently. I think this is easily the biggest departure from a typical first-person shooter. In any other first-person shooter, you essentially just have to learn the basic mechanics of the game. Your character will behave slightly differently depending on your setup, but ultimately every single player has the same set of tools. In Overwatch, it's very much about mastering your specific character's toolsets. For example, Bastion does mega damage and has excellent range when in turret mode, but he's incredibly vulnerable when he's in this turret mode. So it's important to find a good vantage point to maximize his damage output, but it's also important to remain mobile because in turret mode you'll be very easy to take out. Reinhardt is one of my favorite characters in the game, and he's awesome for helping your team push forward. He's incredibly powerful up close, but as I mentioned before, he can easily get wrecked by Reaper and also Tracer. The other character that I really like playing in Overwatch would be Genji. He has one of the highest skill caps in the game, but he can be incredibly powerful when he's used correctly. The point that I'm trying to make is that all the characters behave very differently, and doing well involves not only mastering the game's core mechanics, but understanding your character's unique abilities and how to use them the most effectively in a variety of situations. This sounds pretty straightforward, but knowing the moveset is only one component. Sure, knowing how to perform your character's unique abilities is certainly important, but knowing how to combine them and which combinations are the most effective is definitely key. Genji is a perfect example of this, using his sword slash to get in close or cross up an opponent, and then combining this with either his throwing star or his ultimate is a really effective technique. His sword slash can be used in a lot of different ways. I mean, the obvious one is to get damage, but it can be used for mobility to get to ledges and other areas that you can't get to by normal jumping or mantling. This is also true for D.Va's dash. It's awesome for closing the distance to make her primary weapon more effective, but it can also be really effective for ramming enemies off edges and quickly finishing off opponents with low health. So it's not only important to know your character's moveset and how to use them together in different combinations, but it's also really important to have a deep understanding of each character's abilities and how they can be used in unorthodox ways. This is one of the core components to being successful at a fighting game at a high level. A similar example from a fighting game would be in Street Fighter 4 with the focus attack dash cancel. At a high level, the focus attack is basically a charge attack which can absorb a certain amount of hits, but in Street Fighter 4 it can actually be used mid-combo to elongate the length of the combo. When it's used this way, it's neither absorbing an attack or being used to deal damage, but this is arguably the best way to use this ability, as it allows for some absolutely ridiculous combos.
Oh my god!
The other thing that's really similar about the characters in Overwatch and the characters to other fighting games, or many modern fighting games, is their ultimate abilities. The ultimate is basically the super combo or critical art from the Street Fighter series. There are also a lot of other fighting games that have this mechanic, but I think Street Fighter may have been one of the first. Each character's ultimate is unique, charges up at a different pace, and just like all the other moves, needs to be done at a specific time to maximize its effectiveness. The way that these work is almost exactly like a fighting game. Knowing when to use it, how much damage it will deal, and how to deal with other enemies' ultimates is all part of the game's strategy. So let's move on to stages. How are the stages similar? The stages from Overwatch are from all over the world, and just like the characters, they're stereotypes. So for example, the Egyptian stage is full of sand and ancient Egyptian architecture. The map Ilios from Greece looks like something out of a postcard that you might send while holidaying there. And there are plenty of other maps with cultural references such as Route 66, Dorado, Lijiang Towers. I could go on and on. This is very similar to fighting games. I'm going to use Street Fighter as an example again because I love Street Fighter, but an obvious example from the Street Fighter world would be Chun-Li's stage, which in the past has been depicted with very cliched Chinese backdrops such as the Great Wall of China or a busy city street with lots of bicycles. The last thing that I think is really similar between Overwatch and fighting games is how the story is delivered. The story in Overwatch is incredibly light, or at least it is in the game. There's obviously a whole bunch of cinematics that you can watch via YouTube that Blizzard put out, but in the game itself there's only that small introduction, and apart from that there's very little other story elements. The rest of the story is delivered through small bits of dialogue between the characters, both before and during the matches. You could actually argue that this is even less than fighting games, because a typical fighting game will have an arcade mode where when you fight through you will get an ending and a bit more story for each individual character. But it's a big departure from your typical first-person shooter, which generally has a narrative. Even games like Titanfall, which didn't have a standard campaign, still had a more conventional storytelling method for a first-person shooter than Overwatch does. So that's all the things that stand out to me that make me think that Overwatch has more in common with fighting games than first-person shooters. Now obviously this is just a theory, this is just something that has been spinning around in my mind for quite a while, and many of you may disagree. But if you do agree, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are, and if you think that there's anything else or any other similarities between the fighting game genre and Overwatch. Anyway, that's all I've got for you in this video. I want to thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm out.